Asserting central dominion. This pawn immediately stakes a claim. Opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. Instantly establishing a pawn chain. This Sicilian defense creates an asymmetrical battleground and challenges white's central ambitions. Initiating development. This knight prepares to contest central squares and supports a potential d4 advance. Keeping options open. Shielding the king's advance. This pawn asserts influence in the center. A hallmark of Sicilian defenses aiming for counterplay. Challenging the center immediately establishes a dynamic pawn struggle, aiming to seize space and open lines for rapid development. Opening the center for piece play and surrendering central pawn presence is the gamble here. Opening up a dynamic struggle. Unlocking the central diagonal for the queen and knight, white asserts immediate central influence in this Sicilian setup. Challenging the knight's central dominance. This move prompts a strategic re-evaluation of piece placement. Asserting central presence. This knight bolsters a pawn structure, preparing for further territorial claims. Developing another piece towards the center. Black prepares to castle and aims to contest the d4 outpost. Developing the bishop to a less aggressive square like e2 often signals an intention to castle kingside soon and prepare a solid structure. Opting for positional safety over immediate tactical aggression, which is a sensible choice in this open Sicilian variation where rapid exchanges can lead to unforeseen complications for the king. Preparing a fianchetto of the bishop to the h7b1 diagonal is a common theme in this variation, aiming to contest white's central control and prepare for kingside castling. Securing the king immediately allows white to focus on developing their remaining pieces and potentially launch an attack on the kingside, while also preparing to contest control of the open d-file. Black solidifies their grip on the dark squares, preparing to activate the fianchettoed bishop and contest the central tension. The knight retreats to b3, subtly reinforcing the center and preparing for potential central pawn advances or a maneuver to the queenside, while simultaneously avoiding contact with black's developing kingside pieces. Solidifying the king's safety. A prudent decision to tuck the monarch away behind a protective pawn shield, completely mirroring white's recent castling. Securing the monarch from any sudden discovered attacks or diagonal threats along the long diagonal. This quiet maneuver prepares to activate the rook on h1, potentially aiming for the kingside assault that often characterizes this Sicilian setup. Guarding the queen's bishop's advance. This pawn maneuver anticipates development while subtly preparing for a queenside expansion, potentially targeting the c4 square for piece placement or a pawn lever. Probing the queenside flank now. White aims to restrict black's typical counterplay, potentially preparing for a c5 pawn advance later or even a direct assault on black's queenside structure. This move subtly challenges black's pawn chain and seeks to gain a spatial advantage, forcing black to commit to a defensive or counter-attacking plan. Steering the queenside pawn structure towards the center. This maneuver aims to foster greater queenside pawn presence and potentially challenge white's control of the a4 square, even if it momentarily concedes a slight structural alteration to the pawn chain. Initiating a central pawn push. f4 aims to seize more kingside space and potentially open the f-file for your rook later, disrupting black's relatively solid setup. Black develops the bishop to its natural fianchetto square, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Focusing the bishop to the open diagonal intensifies pressure along this crucial line, directly challenging black's queenside control and potentially creating weaknesses around the d6 pawn. Unleashing the knight for a centralizing endeavor. Black aims to reposition this piece to a more influential square, potentially f6 or even e5, while simultaneously preparing to challenge White's advanced pawns on the kingside. This knight maneuver is characteristic of Sicilian setups, seeking to disrupt White's harmonious pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay, solidifying the queenside structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion. This bishop reroutes itself to a more active diagonal, eyeing the important d4 square and supporting a future advance of the c-pawn. Centralizing the rook on the open c-file signals a clear intention to contest that important pathway, preparing for potential advances or defensive maneuvers along this crucial diagonal. Preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook. This maneuver subtly fortifies the kingside against potential pawn pushes while also freeing the other rook to potentially join the attack or reinforce the defense. Shifting the knight to the edge of the board on a5. This piece is now poised to investigate the queenside, potentially eyeing c4 or even preparing a jump to b3 to disrupt White's central pawns. While it seems passive initially, it's a strategic repositioning aiming to create future counterplay and force White to constantly reassess their queenside defenses, preventing easy expansion. Opening the a-file for potential infiltration. This exchange initiates a structural adjustment, trading a knight that was somewhat awkwardly placed on b3 for a bishop that exerts pressure on the queenside. White aims to exploit the now open highway, perhaps preparing for a future pawn storm or a rook lift to the central ranks. The immediate consequence is a slight simplification, but it also creates a lingering weakness on the b-file for Black if they aren't careful with their pawn structure. Opening the b-file offers Black a temporary pawn majority on that side, but it weakens the a5 square and potentially creates a backward pawn for White on a2 later if White isn't careful. Consider how this diagonal exchange might influence future piece placement. Stepping back from immediate central contention, White repositions their rook, aiming to control the a-file and potentially eye the queenside weaknesses that Black's pawn structure presents. This seemingly passive rook maneuver prepares for a future skirmish on the open file, preventing Black from freely dominating that area and creating a base from which to launch further queenside action. Considering the doubled pawns on b6 and a5, White is setting up for a strategic play to exploit the structural fragility, perhaps by a future push of the a-pawn or by placing pressure on these squares. The rook's journey to a3 might also be a preparatory step for reinforcing the kingside, should Black choose to launch an offensive there, offering a more active defensive posture. It signifies a shift in White's focus, moving away from direct central confrontation towards a more nuanced queenside battle, where positional advantages can be gradually accrued. Black repositions the rook to the fourth rank, creating a dynamic imbalance and eyeing potential pressure on the queenside, asserting pressure along the third rank. This maneuver aims to exploit the potentially awkward placement of Black's rook on c4, seeking to disrupt White's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially open lines for attack. Shifting the queen to c8 aims to pressure the c3 knight and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside, but it potentially neglects the kingside defense and allows White to build a strong central presence. The queen's repositioning to d3 aims to centralize its power, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing for a kingside push by supporting a future f5 advance, while also connecting the rooks more effectively. Introducing a dynamic threat, this maneuver seeks to exploit the weakened queenside pawns while simultaneously activating the rook to a more centralized, aggressive posting. The immediate consequence of bringing the rook to b4 is the creation of an unbalanced position. It places pressure on white's b-pawn, and if white is not careful, could lead to a loss of material or significant positional concessions. This move also hints at a broader plan to create complications and potentially exchange pieces in a way that favors black, especially given white's slightly awkward rook placement on a3. It's a move that forces white to react, rather than allowing them to continue with their developing intentions unchallenged. The geometrical alignment of black's pieces now becomes more menacing, with the rook and queen potentially coordinating attacks along open or semi-open files if white doesn't find a suitable counter. Reasserting control over the crucial central files. The rook's repositioning aims to disrupt black's ambitious bishop battery and prepare for a potential pawn advance on the kingside, offering a more dynamic continuation than passively defending. Reclaiming the pawn on a4 is a tactical necessity, but this knight maneuver to c5 offers a compelling positional alternative, aiming to disrupt white's rook battery and potentially create an outpost for itself on d3. Sacrificing the bishop opens up a crucial diagonal for the queen and promises to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, offering white a dynamic initiative despite relinquishing the bishop pair, challenging the bishop's dominance and creating a dynamic imbalance. This captures the key central pawn and immediately seeks to exploit the open d-file, a crucial pathway for black's queen and rooks to infiltrate white's territory. The doubled pawns on the queenside, while a slight structural concession, are compensated by the active placement of the queen, now eyeing weaknesses around white's castled king. This maneuver signals black's intent to transition from a defensive posture to a more aggressive, counter-attacking game, gaining central influence by rerouting the knight to a more active diagonal on d1, aiming to potentially redeploy it to c3 or even e3. Addresses the slight overextension of the f4 pawn and prepares to contest the d-file more effectively. Black shores up the rook's position on the crucial c-file, preparing for a potential pawn break on c5 or a repositioning to the b-file, while simultaneously preventing white's knight from establishing dominance on d5, opening the b-file for potential infiltration. This exchange aims to simplify the position and test black's pawn structure on the queenside. By eliminating a defender of that vital file, white hopes to create targets or gain a tempo for other operations, while simultaneously offering to trade off pieces and potentially transition towards an endgame. Opening the queenside for your rooks. This pawn thrust aims to seize the open file and create dynamic play, though it does leave the c-pawn somewhat isolated and potentially vulnerable to future advances by white's queenside pieces. The rook on b4 is now attacked twice and defended only once, creating an immediate tactical problem that white hopes to exploit. A startling gambit of material for active piece play, sacrificing a pawn to create crucial attacking avenues on the kingside and potentially open the b-file for powerful penetration. Recapturing the pawn immediately opens lines and simplifies the position, transforming it into a dynamic tactical exchange rather than a slow positional grind. And the doubled pawns on white's queenside will become a key weakness for black to exploit in the upcoming endgame if white isn't careful. This is a tactical skirmish, and you're hoping to exploit the doubled pawns to gain initiative. The queen's maneuver offers a complex counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's structure and potentially create threats against the king. Observe how the immediate capture on c4, while seemingly forcing, opens up lines for white. Consider the long-term implications of this queen centralization. It might become a target. Keep an eye on that weak pawn on a4. Perhaps it can be leveraged later. A fundamental structural alteration is initiated here. simplifying the material while aiming to exploit the resulting pawn formations. Black's rook now claims the open c-file, a powerful outpost that white will struggle to dislodge, particularly with the doubled pawns on the queenside hindering any rapid counterplay. Solidifying the pawn chain creates a robust central structure, addressing the potential weakness on the queenside pawn passed to black. Repositioning the rook to the d-file seems to be the goal, aiming to contest or even seize control of that open file. Unlocking the d5 square with pawn thrust adds immediate dynamism, aiming to cramp black's queenside and disrupt their pawn structure while potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Embracing the central pawn exchange, black immediately opens lines, potentially activating the rook on the now open e-file. Opening up the f-file now directly challenges the pawn on e5 and seeks to activate white's rook for central influence, potentially creating new attacking avenues while simultaneously straining black's queenside pawn structure. Seizing the open file with the rook creates an immediate imbalance, but it comes at the cost of sacrificing material control, as the pawn on b3 is now heavily defended. Unleashing a pawn avalanche, white throws a decisive blow, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and expose their pieces. The pawn's march to e6 severs black's crucial d7-7 diagonal, creating a potent outpost for white's pieces and a potential spearhead for an assault. This move fundamentally alters the positional landscape, forcing black to react defensively and consider sacrifices to maintain their integrity. The queenside pawn structure, once robust, now appears vulnerable and disconnected. White capitalizes on black's recent queenside activity, transforming a seemingly balanced position into one with sharp, immediate attacking potential. The doubled pawns on the c-file, a consequence of the exchanges, now become less of a weakness as white shifts focus to the kingside and central penetration. This is not just a pawn move, it's a strategic earthquake. Opening the king's shield creates immediate tactical hazards, forcing a drastic re-evaluation of your defensive structure and potentially exposing critical squares. Unlocking a crucial open file and forcing a pawn exchange on the kingside. This maneuver strategically simplifies the position, aiming to leverage material superiority in the ensuing endgame. The rook, now unhindered after the exchange on the queenside, immediately plunges into white's territory, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create immediate threats against the exposed king.